July 2016 in New Zealand turned out to be especially harsh. Mount Aspiring National Park, sprawling over more than 300,000 hectares, greeted winter with a thick layer of snow. At the heart of the park, amid sheer cliffs and ancient glaciers, lies the famous Routeburn Track, one of the 9 great walking routes in the country. In summer, this 32-kilometer trail attracts thousands of tourists from around the world. They come here to witness majestic mountain valleys, crystal-clear lakes, and the snow-capped peaks of the Southern Alps. But with the onset of winter, the Routeburn Track transforms dramatically. Ascending to an altitude of 1,300 meters above sea level, the route becomes a severe test even for experienced mountaineers. During the winter period, a special atmosphere of danger reigns here. Sudden snowstorms can descend in a matter of minutes, turning a clear day into a whiteout fog. Avalanches regularly cascade down the slopes, burying everything in their path. Temperatures often drop to -15 to 20 degrees Celsius, and strong winds amplify the sensation of cold, making it almost unbearable. The New Zealand Department of Conservation strongly recommends that tourists refrain from undertaking the route during this time of year. But not everyone heeds these warnings. In February 2016, a young couple from the Czech Republic arrived in New Zealand in search of adventure. 30-year-old Pavlina Pazova and 27-year-old Andrei Petr obtained tourist visas and were full of ambitious plans. Like many other travelers, they decided to start by earning money on local farms to save up for trips around the country. The small town of Motueka became their first home in this distant land. Here, on apple orchards, they spent long days harvesting fruit. The work was grueling, from endless picking of produce, but the dream was worth it. Every earned dollar brought them closer to their goal. They hoped to find jobs in one of the local restaurants or mountain hotels. They believed they could combine work with travel, discovering new routes and the beauties of this amazing country. When job searches in Queenstown yielded no results, the couple began looking for other ways to spend their time productively. For several months, they explored the surroundings of the city, undertaking short hikes along local trails. Gradually, their attention was drawn to the Routeburn Track, one of New Zealand's most scenic walking routes, known for its mountain lakes and majestic passes. This decision, made almost casually, forever changed their lives. On the morning of July 25th, they visited the office of the Department of Conservation in Queenstown. It should be noted that in New Zealand, this time of year falls in the middle of winter. The local ranger, upon learning of their plans, immediately raised the alarm. He persistently tried to explain to them the full danger of the route in the winter period. The ranger detailed the frequent snowstorms, the risks of avalanches, and how many sections of the trail are completely hidden under a thick layer of snow. He particularly emphasized that the weather forecast for the coming days predicted a severe deterioration in conditions. But the couple, enthralled by the route, were confident they could handle it. Their preparation for the hike turned out to be catastrophically inadequate for winter conditions. In their backpacks, there was none of the essentials. No crampons for walking on ice, no ice axes, not even a tent. Only sleeping bags and the hope of reaching mountain huts along the route. They also didn't take an emergency locator beacon, a device that could transmit a signal to rescuers in case of trouble. Moreover, they didn't leave anyone information about their route. Another fatal mistake. That evening, they parked their camper at the start of the track. They spent their last peaceful night there, making plans for the upcoming hike, unaware that the New Zealand mountains were preparing a terrifying ordeal for them. Early in the morning on July 26th, Pavlina and Andrei stepped onto the Routeburn Trail. The day began relatively calmly. The sky was clear, and the air was fresh and invigorating. The first kilometers of the path gave no hint of trouble. The road, though covered in snow, was well marked, and the pair confidently advanced forward. By evening, they reached the first stopping point, the Flats Hut. This small wooden shelter, located in a picturesque valley, became their refuge for the first night. They were the only guests in the hut, a fact that should have alarmed experienced travelers. In winter, empty huts on popular routes are a sure sign that locals avoid this trail for good reason. The next morning, around 10 a.m., they continued on, heading toward Harris Saddle. The weather promised worsening conditions, but the air seemed stable enough to proceed. However, just an hour later, the weather began to change. The sky was covered with heavy gray clouds, a piercing wind rose, and then snow began to fall. Visibility gradually deteriorated, and what should have been a few-hour crossing stretched into 5 exhausting hours. With each step, walking became harder. The snow reached their knees, and the trail gradually disappeared under the freshly fallen blanket. Upon reaching Harris Saddle, they saw a sign indicating that it was still 3 hours to Mackenzie Hut. Deciding that the most difficult part of the route was behind them, they pressed on. This was a fatal mistake. Shortly after they left the saddle, the weather changed abruptly. The snowfall intensified, visibility plummeted, and their tracks were covered almost instantly. By 5 p.m., it was getting dark rapidly. The wind strengthened to gale force. Its gusts were so powerful that they had to bend low to maintain balance. Thick fog engulfed everything around, like a white shroud, turning the familiar world into an unrecognizable nightmare. The markers that usually indicated the path had completely disappeared under the snow. In complete disorientation, they began circling the slope. Each subsequent step seemed identical to the previous one, and time seemed to stop in this white chaos. They tried to use a compass, but in conditions of zero visibility, even it couldn't help them. Exhausted and lost, they made the only possible decision: find shelter for the night. After long searches, the only suitable place turned out to be a sheer cliff under which they could somewhat hide from the merciless wind. This night became a true test of their endurance. Without a tent, with only a thin tarp for protection from the elements, they tried to preserve body heat by pressing against each other under their improvised shelter. Their clothes gradually soaked through, making the cold even more piercing. Pavlina didn't close her eyes all night, fearing they would be buried in snow if she allowed herself to sleep. Every gust of wind threatened to tear away their fragile cover, and the temperature continued to drop. At dawn, the sky cleared a bit, and they saw the cruel irony of their situation. Mackenzie Hut was not far away, beyond the snowy ridges that the bad weather had hidden yesterday. In the morning light, it seemed so close and accessible. Gathering their last strength and inspired by the proximity of the saving refuge, they immediately set off, imagining how soon they would be in warmth and safety. But the mountains had prepared one last, most terrifying trial for them. The marked trail to Lake Mackenzie was steep and completely buried in snow. To save time, they decided to go straight across, a decision dictated by exhaustion and a desperate desire to reach the hut sooner. But instead of descending to the hut, they began ascending an unknown mountain spur. By noon, the sky was again covered with clouds, and the piercing wind intensified. The search for the right path took several hours. Soon, the first signs that something was wrong with Andre began to appear. His movements became sluggish, his speech started to slur. Despite the cold, he unexpectedly pulled off his wet pants, claiming something incoherent. But he continued to insist that everything was fine with him. This was a classic manifestation of hypothermia, a condition where overcooling begins to affect brain function. The day was drawing to a close when they stopped at a large, overhanging rock to find any sign of the trail. Andre stayed by the rock, promising he would catch up soon. When she returned, she found him in a strange state. He had taken off his down jacket, muttering something incoherent about it being ruined. His face was unnaturally flushed despite the frost. This was another ominous sign of severe hypothermia. Twilight thickened unusually quickly due to the dense cloud cover. They tried to go further. Now Pavlina led, and Andre slowly followed her. Suddenly, she turned at a sound and saw that he had stopped, staring blankly at the ground. His eyes were glassy, and when he tried to say something, his speech became completely unintelligible. At that moment, the snow beneath them suddenly gave way, and they both plummeted into darkness. In the fall, Pavlina lost her headlamp and glove, left in complete darkness. The slope turned out to be steep, about 45 degrees, and they flew almost 20 meters down before stopping. With trembling legs, she began descending lower, trying to find Andre in the pitch blackness. She had to practically feel her way across every centimeter of the slope. Soon she found him. He was wedged between huge boulders and trunks of fallen trees, and his heavy backpack on his back only worsened his entrapment in the crevice. His breathing was becoming shallower. Each inhale came with difficulty. The temperature at that moment had dropped to -12 degrees, and gusts of wind amplified the sensation of cold. Pavlina desperately tried to pull Andrei out, but any attempt to move him threatened further falling down the slope. They were on a narrow ledge, and in the darkness, it was impossible to determine the depth of the abyss below. Gradually, Andrei's breathing became less frequent until it stopped altogether. In despair, she found his backpack and pulled out a spare flashlight from it, but it was already too late. Andrei showed no signs of life. The next 2 nights became the most terrifying in Pavlina's life. She was left alone in the mountains, next to the body of the man with whom she had built plans for the future just a few days ago. Hiding from the piercing wind behind the same rocks that had taken Andrei's life, she fought not only the cold but also waves of despair. She had very little food left, too little to sustain her strength for long. The temperature continued to drop, reaching -15 degrees at night, and her soaked clothes turned into an icy shell. Despite the emotional pain and physical exhaustion, she forced herself to move, doing physical exercises to preserve warmth. But her strength ebbed with every hour. In those endless nights, her only companions were the howl of the wind and the impenetrable darkness that could drive anyone mad. On the 3rd day, realizing that help was coming from nowhere, she made the hardest decision of her life: leave Andrei's body and try to save herself. Gathering the last remnants of food and melting some snow for water, she began her solitary journey through snowdrifts and rocky scree. Her boots were soaked through, and without gloves, her hands quickly lost sensation. Every few minutes, she had to stop and massage her fingers to avoid frostbite. Thick fog enveloped the mountains. Visibility did not exceed 10 meters, making navigation practically impossible. She walked, often sinking waist-deep in snow. Each step required unimaginable effort. With the onset of night, Pavlina found shelter under an overhanging rock, where she was almost completely buried in fresh snow during sleep. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees, and by morning, her hands and feet were so numb that she could barely move her fingers. But she knew that if she stayed in place, it would mean certain death. By noon, Pavlina noticed faint outlines of Mackenzie Hut down in the valley. Gathering her last strength, she began descending to the lake. Massive boulders surrounded the lake on all sides, forming the only possible path to the hut, and every step through this rocky labyrinth could be her last. From exhaustion, she slipped and fell into icy water, but the proximity of the saving refuge gave her the strength to climb out and reach her goal. The hut turned out to be empty. No one had been here for a long time, but inside, Pavlina found the essentials for survival: stocks of canned goods, dry foods, and a gas stove with remaining fuel. As in most high mountain huts in New Zealand, there was no phone or radio communication here. She realized that no one might even suspect her disappearance, since she and Andrei hadn't left anyone information about their route. The next 30 days, this hut became her only refuge. Pavlina developed a strict rationing system. Every meal was carefully measured. She set a rigid daily routine for herself, understanding that structure would help her preserve her sanity in complete solitude. Mornings began with checking the weather and the state of the snow around the hut, then stretching and exercises as much as her frostbitten limbs allowed. Outside the windows, avalanches could often be seen descending. Freshly fallen snow created additional stress on the slopes. Pavlina kept records of weather conditions in a found notebook. This information could be useful for planning a possible escape. Using ash from the fire, she wrote a huge letter H on the snow, the international signal for help for passing helicopters. Every day, she maintained this sign, not letting snow bury it. Several times, she heard the sound of helicopter engines and tried to attract attention with jackets, scarves, even attempting to use reflections of sunlight from metal objects. But the helicopters flew by without noticing her signals in the snowy wasteland. In an attempt to maintain physical fitness and combat despair, she forced herself to train every day despite the frostbite. Pavlina performed exercises with her backpack near the hut, preparing for a possible self-descent from the mountains. She understood that if help didn't come, she would have to seek a path to salvation on her own. The hardest trials were the nights. In the darkness, thoughts inevitably returned to Andre, to that fatal day, and to all the decisions that led them to this route. Sleep came with difficulty, interrupted by the sounds of mountain bad weather and the cold from which it seemed impossible to hide even in the hut. On August 26, 2016, the silence of the mountains was broken by the sound of an approaching helicopter. Pavlina, already accustomed to disappointments, nevertheless ran out of the hut in a bright rescue vest. The helicopter from the New Zealand Rescue Service circled over Lake Mackenzie. By this time, the families of Pavlina and Andre had already endured several weeks of real nightmare. First, rare messages on Facebook turned to complete silence, then calls stopped going through. Alarmed parents tried to contact hostels and hotels in Queenstown, but no one had seen the young Czech couple. In desperation, they began mass writing to the Czech consulate in New Zealand. Vladka Kenneth, the consul of the Czech Republic living in Lenore near Queenstown, was literally inundated with messages from worried relatives in Europe. She immediately contacted the New Zealand Department of Conservation, passing on all available information about the missing tourists. When it was discovered that Pavlina and Andre had planned to hike the route burn track, the local police organized a check of parking lots at the start of the route. There, their camper was found, having stood motionless for almost a month. Rescuers methodically surveyed the route by helicopter until they spotted a figure desperately waving her arms near Mackenzie Hut. After several attempts to land in difficult weather conditions, the helicopter finally managed to touch down on a small platform near the hut. What the rescuers saw shocked even seasoned professionals. Despite exhaustion, Pavlina maintained clarity of mind. Her fingers were severely frostbitten, but she continued to keep order in the hut and record her survival. The rescuers noted her astonishing organization. All remaining supplies were neatly sorted. To avoid complicating the helicopter takeoff, Pavlina was immediately transported to the hospital in Queenstown, where a team of doctors was already awaiting her arrival. The medics were stunned. Despite serious frostbite on her fingers and toes, Pavlina's overall condition remained stable. Her survival in such extreme conditions was called a true miracle by the doctors. 2 days later, on August 28th, rescuers discovered Andre's body. It was on a steep slope, about 2 kilometers from the hut, wedged between rocks and fallen trees. The complex terrain and non-stop snowfall made evacuating the body an especially difficult task. Rescuers needed several hours and special mountaineering equipment to reach it. Shortly after her rescue, Pavlina Pazova held a short press conference. She openly admitted all the mistakes they had made with Andre, from the lack of necessary equipment, ignoring weather warnings, and most importantly, the decision not to leave anyone information about their route. This case became a turning point for the safety system on New Zealand's mountain routes. The Department of Conservation strengthened control over winter hikes and tightened requirements for tourists' equipment in the cold season. Now, anyone planning a winter hike on difficult routes is required to have an emergency locator beacon and leave a detailed plan of their route. In a thank you letter to the Department of Conservation, Pavlina wrote, "The well-equipped hut literally saved my life. Nothing can express my gratitude for the infrastructure you created." To the rescuers, she sent a separate message expressing appreciation for their enormous efforts in rescuing her and returning Andre to his family. The story of Pavlina and Andre became a harsh reminder that mountains do not forgive recklessness. Even the most picturesque route can turn into a deadly trap if preparation is approached irresponsibly. In the mountains, there is no room for chance. Every detail, from proper equipment to informing loved ones about plans, can be decisive in the fight for life. Today, the route burn track remains one of New Zealand's most popular routes. Thousands of tourists walk this trail every year, enjoying magnificent views. But now, in briefings before hikes, rangers often tell the story of the 2 Czech tourists as a reminder that even the most beautiful place can pose deadly danger. This story makes one think about the thin line between the thirst for adventure and recklessness. What drives people to ignore obvious warnings of danger? Perhaps it's faith in their own strength, or maybe simple carelessness, or a desire to challenge the elements? How would you act in Pavlina's place after the death of your loved one? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, give it a like. This will help more people learn about the importance of a responsible approach to mountain hikes. Subscribe to the channel. Ahead of us are many more captivating stories about survival in extreme conditions. And for now, take care of yourself and your loved ones. Don't forget that any adventure must be thoroughly prepared. See you in the next episodes.